Thank you so much. Appreciate you coming to a session very late in the conference. And I've got some really exciting things to speak with you about. I've spent the last 2.5 years working specifically with security automation and orchestration, and then applying that to the security response process, as well as to the threat intel and sharing process. And so I'd like to do is go over a little bit about what we've learned as we've gone through this, and give you some use cases and some tips as you potentially look at using threat intelligence sharing and automation to help bolster your own security program. So the place I'd like to start is there's all kinds of data out there on just kind of where the security landscape is today. And I think we all know that with the number of breaches that we've seen in the news over the last several years, that all of us as security professionals are struggling with the security response process. Now, this is a statistic from the Ponemon Institute, and one of the reasons I like what the Ponemon Institute does with their data is they're actually focused on the cost of a breach, and they do a lot of primary research. They speak with over 380 organizations around the world and get real data, of course, anonymized once they publish the data to get the aggregate of the time it takes to work on breaches, how much financial loss there is. But one of the reasons I like this data is that they've been tracking it for a number of years. And so this report came out earlier this month and said that the mean time to identify a breach was 197 days, so just over 6 months. Now, the number for the last several years has been very similar. In 2017, the number was 191. In 2016, the number was 197, and the year before that, it was 201. So that data, where we're looking at it over time, we're not getting better at this as an industry. Now, one could argue we're getting a little bit better because the complexity has changed during those 4 years, and we've stayed at this consistent number. But even if this number, and there's lots of organizations who put out similar data, and even if this number was half or 1/3, I think we'd all say that it's too long. Now, the second number that goes with this is the number of days it takes to actually solve the problem. So how many days does it take to contain the breach? And in their most recent data, it came out that it was 69 days. The previous year, it was 66. The previous year before that, it was 71. So it's very consistent that we're struggling with first identifying and then containing. And so within ServiceNow, we've done some research as well in terms of trying to look at why. And so as we start to look at why it takes so long, we found 3 major areas. The first was unpatched vulnerabilities. Now, this may feel very obvious to a lot of you. We did a research study in the first part of this year where we spoke with just under 3,000 individuals in security roles across 9 different countries. And what we found there was actually very consistent around the world, but just under half of those organizations had been breached in the previous 2 years. It was actually 48%. And the vast majority of those breaches occurred not just because of an unpatched vulnerability, but there was an unpatched vulnerability that the organization knew about. They actually knew they had the vulnerability and hadn't done anything about it yet. Now, many times when speaking with senior leaders within an organization, when there's an unpatched vulnerability, it feels like a very simple process, right? Oh, you've got a vulnerability, patch it. But we all know that it's much more complex than that, than updating your mobile phone or updating your personal computer. When you start to multiply that by hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of servers, and when you're also working adjacent to an IT department who doesn't want downtime for the patch, it becomes a pretty big struggle. But this was the first thing that we saw as a cause in this data. The second was getting incomplete information when working on a security incident. Now, over the last several years, we've all put in more security technology. If we would have had this conversation 10 years ago, we'd be talking about AV signatures and maybe moving away and starting to look at IPS and a few other things. But over time, as we've put in dozens of security products whether for protection or detecting something that a protection product may have missed, all of them generate an alert. And those alerts for most organizations typically go into a mailbox, and a security analyst goes and picks those up and starts to work on them. But a lot of times, they're missing a lot of information, where you might understand what the problem is, and in security, we kind of live in a world of IP addresses, and so we'd get information about the IP address of the affected system, and maybe a lot of information about potential URLs or a malicious payload, et cetera. But what we were missing is a lot of context about what the actual system that has the problem is. The third area has to do with manual process. While we've bought a lot of different security tools for protection and detection, when it comes to actually doing the work, once security analysts are getting all the information from all these different tools and putting them into, and getting this email box, what happens when any of us get overwhelmed with information? Like, not just in security, but in any part of our life. We put the information into the best data repository we all know how to use, which is Microsoft Excel or some sort of spreadsheet or Google Sheet. We take the data and we put it in there and we organize it. And then as we're working through things and we need to communicate back to people, we might actually take that spreadsheet and then email it off to different people and ask them to go do work. This is another area of the research that we did where we found that in the security response process, organizations were losing 12 days per incident due to manual process where people are passing information back and forth via spreadsheets and email. And so this is an area where you start thinking about, you could start to see where this theme comes in, where there's a lot of areas here that could be very ripe for using some newer technologies around automation. And this is a great place to get started even before getting into using threat intel. So as you said, automating security response is the future. And this is an area I've been working in for the last 2.5 years. And the industry is actually starting to embrace it, although it's still very early. Some very leading indicators are here. At the very beginning of this year, Forrester came out with a technology predictions for 2018. And security automation was number 3 on this list out of 10 total. And this was not security technology predictions. This was technology predictions overall. So included things like the growth of IoT, lots of things around machine learning and artificial intelligence. But actually using automation and security was the number 3 technology to watch over the next 3 years. A second data point is in November of last year, Gartner actually defined a security automation market. And they called it security orchestration, automation, and response. And there's several different types of technologies available to do this. But the key thing that they found was that in the enterprise, these technologies are less than 1% penetrated, meaning that less than 1 of every 100 organizations is actually actively looking at and testing these security automation technologies. But what they did say is that they expect this to grow by 15 times in the next 3 years, meaning that 15% of organizations will be using some sort of automation as part of their security process by the end of 2020. Now, the last one here is from CSO, and there's a particular reason why I picked this one. They had a list of, I think it was 7 predictions, and they were actually more specific in the security automation prediction. They said that automation of threat detection tasks were going to increase in 2018. Now, this is really a really important distinction, because I think when I hear automation, I think my brain usually goes to something's going to happen, and then some sort of automation technology is going to fix the problem. And so, can you imagine in security if there's some sort of security incident, and then some fancy machine learning, artificial intelligence automation is going to fix all the problems, and security people are going to just see the outcome and be done? We know it's not realistic. But looking at threat detection, this is an area that can be very interesting for automation, because this is an area where there's a ton of manual, repetitive, cut and paste tasks that teams are doing. So I really liked this part of that prediction, because they were very specific about how organizations are going to be looking at using automation in the security area. And this is an area around doing investigation, around research, especially looking at threat intel sources, but also sharing that information with other people. The other thing I put on here at the very bottom of the slide is really you must get the basics right before you jump into automation. Most organizations are using spreadsheets and email to manage a lot of the security response process in terms of working through different teams. But the equivalent of moving to automation would be taking a small baby who just learned how to crawl and then asking that baby to go run 1 mile. The act of going from spreadsheets and email to automation is a similar leap. And there's some very basic things that you need to get done ahead of that, which I'm going to go over. So I'm going to go over kind of 2 automation frameworks before jumping into some use cases that will fall within these different frameworks. So the first one will be around using automation for managing the patching or the vulnerability response process. So the first part of this process would be starting with number 1, is taking the information from your vulnerability scanner. So whether that could be several of the vendors that are upstairs, and some of you may use more than one of them, but taking that data, and whether you've got it housed by the vulnerability scanner themselves, or taking that information and putting it into some sort of database to then go and process it is the first step. So you've got a single repository for all of the vulnerability scan data. From there, once that data comes through, you move to box number 2, or circle number 2, which is around automating the prioritization of those vulnerabilities. Now, most organizations, when they're automating all the different vulnerable items they have, they're typically using the CVSS score. So how severe is the vulnerability? Is it a 1, or is it a 5, is it an 8? And then we'll put into practice some sort of policy on how quickly we're going to respond to it based on that CVSS score. But if you're taking the vulnerability scan data and then putting it into some sort of database where you can work with it, you could use automation to then take that data and correlate it with an asset management database. So think about all the data that IT has, where IT understands what a system is, who owns it, what are the business services that run on that system, what are those applications, and then what are the dependencies. So if server A has a vulnerability, but server A is connected to server C, and server C has PII on it, server A is a pretty important thing to go and work on as well. And so but this is an area that's very ripe for automation, taking an up-to-date asset management database, correlating that with scan data, and then from there, moving to item number 3, which is set the rules on the data between the CVSS score, the affected asset, and the information from the vulnerability scanner, and then automatically create the change request. So automatically take in the information from those tools to then farm out the tasks to the right people that say, maybe you've got a group of people who own Windows servers, or maybe in a specific location, and automatically process all the tasks to that person. So then they're going to get the information that they need to then go and trigger the patching in the correct priority. So not just the CVSS score, but also understanding the asset. And so up to this point, so going to number 3, we have not had a human involved yet. The scan data, we all scan on a regular basis. Taking the scan data, automatically correlating with a database, automatically from the information from the scan data and the asset management database to then create a rule set, to then send tasks off to a patching team. So to your organization, after you set the rule set up, automation can get you all the way to the point of, I know what the most important items are to fix and when they need to get fixed. So then when you move to, after you've gone to number 3 and the person's got the patch request, you can then move to item number 4, which is then coordinating the change planning. So depending on the severity of the problem and the affected asset, you could then set up, when am I going to patch this system? Clearly a lot of the patches require downtime or reboot. And so being able to then coordinate that time, this is definitely a task that is, at this point, probably best equipped for humans so that we can go ahead and at that point be able to put the patch in place. And then once the patch has been deployed, so we've finished item number 4, once the patch is deployed, there's another place where automation can really help. Is let's say the task is done and the patching team says, okay, we've pushed the patch out. There's another task that you can do to really make sure that the problem is gone by automatically triggering a rescan of the vulnerability scanner to that asset to not just know that the patch has been pushed out, but that the vulnerability is no longer present because the vulnerability scanner who found it in the first place now has confirmed that it's gone. So this is really just taking what we do a lot between spreadsheets and email and turning it into an automated process. And there are places in here using automation, places in here using humans, but the idea of having this workflow from end to end is the basis of getting the basics right before taking on automation. Now, a second use case would be doing this for security incident response. This is very, very similar to what we do for working on vulnerabilities, but is a little bit more complex. Where the vulnerability side, there's essentially scan data to integrate with, and in most organizations, you've got 1 scanner, maybe 2. When it comes to taking security incidents from lots of different sources, the most common place to go and pull information would be from your SIEM, but in some cases, you may not have all the data from security alerts going into the SIEM. And so you may need to pull in maybe directly from an endpoint security product or an EDR product or directly from a firewall or directly from other systems. But getting all of the alerts that you're getting from the various products into one place, again, into some sort of database that you can work with is the first step. So again, this is a place where you can pull that data in. All these security products have APIs. This is a relatively simple process today. So take that data and then correlate it again with the asset management database we talked about in the previous slide. So taking the severity of the problem, what's the importance of that asset, correlate that data, and then from there, you've prioritized the security incidents based on severity of the problem and the affected asset, which allows you to move to step number 3, which is once those alerts or incidents have been prioritized, the next thing to do is to then go do some research. This is work that's typically, I'll call it a cut and paste exercise, right? Security analyst goes into a security alert, cuts the IP address out, goes into another tool, puts it into a system, clicks submit, and waits for results. Another area that's ripe for automation. So after getting threat intelligence added to the particular security incident. You can then move to number 4, which is determining what to do. So this is the point, again, where we introduce a human back into the equation. Everything we've done up to this point can be automated. And this is where the human can decide, do I need to go do more, or do I go run the play? So I go get my security run book, and this is a DDoS attack, and here's what I'm going to do. This is a malware outbreak. Here's the plan of action. But then freeing up security analysts to then receive information that this enriched is going to allow people to be able to operate a lot more quickly. So once you've determined what that response action is, you can then decide to go remediate the problem. And this could, a lot of times these are tasks that are not just done by security teams, but maybe done by people in IT. It may be wipe a machine, remove someone's AD credentials, take a machine off of the network, add a new firewall rule. These could be done by various teams, and being able to automatically pass a task over to that person inside of the play is the key to making this happen fast. And then finally, the 6th one here is actually really important from an auditability standpoint. As you use automation to frame up, to make a decision on how we're going to work on a particular security problem, having an auditable record at the end of every timestamp, everything that's happened, and then all the tasks that happen with the automation is going to be key to then, if you ever need to go use that data in some sort of post-mortem or some sort of review of a security incident. You may also refer back to this 6 months later to understand why a particular firewall rule was added in to the organization. But these 2 frameworks are the basis of what I want to do to go over some particular use cases. And I've got 3 here, and then I'm going to go into 2 more around some threat intel sharing use cases that layer inside of the automation. So the first one here is doing some high-profile vulnerability planning and execution. And by high-profile vulnerability, I think of the ones that get a logo now. So the ones like Heartbleed, some of the things we saw last year or earlier with WannaCry. I'm going to use Shellshock as my example to maybe date myself a little bit. But this is the kind of vulnerability that makes the news, not tech news, but actual mainstream news, where executives are going to want to understand, are we affected, and what are we doing about it if we are? And automation is a great way to be able to start to answer that question ahead of potentially getting it. And so the scenario here is we've got a high-profile vulnerability. It's a major software vulnerability has been announced, and we want to be able to start working on it before the execs start asking questions. So the first thing, you take it, you go back to your vulnerability scanner. We know what the vulnerability is, and we can go into an asset management database to then understand what are the servers that have that vulnerability on it, and then what are the different business services or important data that's on those. And this is, again, that correlation of the severity of the problem. In this case, it's really bad. And secondly is, what are the systems that potentially have the issue? From there, you use automation to then automatically prioritize those vulnerable items. So this is where, again, you could use the business service impact. What are the most important assets in the organization? What is the vulnerability risk score? We know there's potential exploit in the wild that will happen quickly, and basically prioritize a set of assets that need to be remediated first, that present the most risk to the organization, and then automatically set up the facilitation of an emergency patch request to the most important systems. I think a lot of where organizations got hung up in many of these major vulnerability announcements is it's everywhere. It's on every system. I've got to go and patch tens of thousands of systems. By understanding the most important systems, you may be able to get that down to hundreds, or maybe dozens, or maybe less, to be able to really farm down the work to something that's going to be significantly easier to work on. And once you've done that work, when the executives or a board, someone, and they want to go and ask the question, this is my shell shock example, when they come and ask the question, you can say, you know what? Yes, we are affected by whatever the vulnerability is. But you know what? We've actually we found all of our critical systems through automation. We've patched all those different systems because we're able to automatically get the tasks to the right people to go and work on it. And then, we also have some systems that we haven't patched yet, but these are the ones that were less critical. And from there, we have a plan for the rest. This is a generic workflow of sending an automated task to the group during the next maintenance window to then go ahead and get the rest of those things patched. This is a significantly better response to give to a senior executive when they are asking, are we affected by this major vulnerability or not? Okay, so use case number 2. And this goes back to a little bit of that CSO prediction about the security investigation or the incident investigation process. So this is what I call a kind of generic flow of what happens with a security analyst once a security incident is generated to do a lot of the research. So the first thing we do here, so a new security incident's been generated. We move to the second box. An analyst is going to then prioritize that security incident and will maybe give it a category and assign it to a particular person or persons to then go and work on, or a team. The next area is that analyst is then going to go into the security incident and look for IP addresses, file hashes, and any other indicators of compromise. They'll then take that information and then go start doing reputational lookups. And so this is where you get into that cutting and pasting, where you've taken information from that security alert, swivel chair to another browser, inserted the information in, click submit, wait for the results, take the next part, put that one in, wait for the results. This is work that takes time. In some organizations, for junior analysts, this could take 30 minutes, 45 minutes. This is a lot of time that really hurts the overall security response process. So the next area is that we may want to go and check the machine where the attack has taken place. So the analyst might go and get the running processes from that particular affected asset. They may go and understand what are the network connections that affected asset has. The next one, they may go, let's go run reputational lookups on all the hashes of files that have been downloaded to that machine, or run every process that doesn't look normal on the machine against something to understand if it's bad or good. And so once they've processed all of those network lookups, again, this can take another 30 minutes to get done. They then move to box number 9 there, as analyst confirms, or in some case denies, that there's an actual threat. And then they can go ahead and start working on the remediation process. These are the steps. You start looking at this for a junior analyst, this could take them, they might only be able to get through 6 to 10 of these a day. Well, when you start to layer in automation, I just changed several of these boxes from red to purple. Now, these are what I call data enrichment activities. And these are areas that is a great place to get started with automation. And I would call this risk-free. You're not making any change to any system automatically. All you're doing is taking the cutting and pasting that analyst is going to do into multiple systems and doing that on behalf of the security analyst. And so things like doing reputational lookups of IP addresses, detonating malware in sandboxes, getting running processes from machines and then going and testing those. These are all tasks that can be automated. And then if I go to box number 9, analysts can spend their time deciding, do I need more? Or do or can I just go ahead and start to assign out the actual remediation process? So this is use case number 2, and using automation in the investigation process. And this is a great way of just going and basically you're automatically getting access to all the great threat intel that's out there. So third one, this is really applying something to the most common security issue that a lot of us work on, which is a a user-reported phishing attack. So user says, I think I got a phishing email. We all have our own security awareness programs where we ask people to send, if they get a suspicious email, to send it to the security team. Most people have an email address of security@company.com, receive that information in, and then someone on the security team, or maybe specifically for larger organizations, an email security team will then go and research, is this a real phishing attack? And so there's actually some pretty neat options in Microsoft. You can click a report phish button that will go to an email box, or just have them forward an email directly. So in this scenario, this is my sort of ugly PayPal email here as an example of a phishing attack. User sends this off to that email address, and what you can do here is automate a bunch of the investigation. So the first thing, when someone sends this email in, or forwards the email in, the first thing you can do is automatically reply with something that says, thank you for submitting, and it reinforces the security awareness. But then automate the investigation of the email. In the same way we just automated the investigation of a security incident, a user-reported phishing attack is another place where you can automate the whole front end of this. So go ahead and do the lookups of the sender. Look, is there any malicious payload in the email? Is there a URL in the email that potentially has malicious payload? These are all steps that can be automated, including detonating malware in a sandbox. Once that comes back, you can deliver a verdict. So the security team can then, when they're opening a user-reported phishing email, they're actually opening that and actually understanding it with all the manual tasks already done for them, so then they can make a decision. And once you make a decision, there's more places to do automation. The first is, if it's not a phishing email, you have a template that says, thank you that you submitted, we appreciate you submitted this. We confirm this is not a phishing email and it's safe. But if it is malicious, automation can then help with that remediation process. Automatically go look inside of the email server to see who else in the organization has received the same email. That phishing attack probably didn't just go to one person. And if somebody's opened it, delete the email from their inbox and automatically trigger a malware scan. And then there's a whole tree of different things you can do from there. If it hasn't been opened, delete it from the mail server so that the user actually doesn't open the email. There's other things you can do in parallel. Automatically update the mail server protection so that it's going to block emails from that particular sender or IP address, and then update firewall rules to block outbound communication to the malicious site that it was trying to attend to. These are all things that can be automated. And so the outcome of all three of these things is just a drastic reduction in the time to solve the problem. So let's dive into then layering threat intel sharing into this. So there's some pretty big challenges with threat intel sharing. The first, almost every time we get any threat intel from somebody, it's always after the fact. Someone's worked on something. It might be something that a commercially available feed has given you, but it's always something that someone else has already run into, and they've probably already solved that problem. The second is operationalizing it. Once you get shared threat intel, then what do you do with it? What do you actually go and do once you're actually going to go work on that? The third is you can get a ton of different sources, and how do you know which one to trust more? This is where you're going to get a combination of some of the information sharing communities as well as commercially available feeds. Which one do you trust more? And then duplicative information. You may see the same information come in from multiple sources. How do you rationalize which one to work on, and how do you rationalize that information together? The fifth, and maybe the most important one, is that most people consume threat intelligence. They don't actually share it. And a lot of this is the fact that most people, I think we all kind of like that, right? I certainly read a lot more things on Yelp than I contribute to, but there's very few people that are contributing to threat intel because there's maybe not a perceived benefit of doing so. And the last one is it real? Or is this fake information? And so this is where many of the ISACs, you never know where the information is coming from. Maybe some of the commercially available threat intel feeds are going to be more interesting, but this is a one-way thing. What about in the sharing community? So this is a concept I want to talk about around using circles of trust to do threat intel sharing. And so this can be simple. And you can get really, really complex with something like this, but simple is the best place to start. So you can create a circle of trust. And maybe the easiest example is we all have people that we used to work with that have moved on to other organizations. And when we're working on something, working on a security incident, there might be times where like, oh, you know what? Like Bill over here was my guy that I would talk to about these types of things. Bill now works at this other company. I still might email Bill or text Bill and ask a quick question. You can start with 3. Think about 3 people that used to work together that now work at different companies, and set up the ability to anonymously share information with each other. So go to a platform, put information up there. The key thing though is actually making it so that it is anonymous. This can work really, really well when sharing is part of the incident response process, not something you do at the end of it. So imagine if you're working on something and you've got this really tight relationship with each other 2 people, and you just learned of something new that you wanted to go pass on. Maybe it's an exploit in the wild, maybe it's a malicious IP address. Just simply cutting and pasting it and dumping it up into your shared circle of trust as part of the incident response process, right as you're working on it, will make this very, very effective for the people receiving it. It'll also encourage your other 2 friends to then go and put their information up there as they're working on it. But anonymous here is key. The biggest reason why most organizations don't share information at this part or this stage of the incident investigation process is you never want to reveal you're the one having the problem. I'm under attack. I always use an example of if you were the biggest oil company in the world and you were under attack, and then the second biggest oil company in the world was under attack, wouldn't the third biggest oil company want to know? And even if you were in the first and second biggest ones, you would want to know because you don't want your industry to go down. So making this, we can do it anonymously where you know this came from somebody you trust. It came from one of your 2 friends you used to work with, but you don't know which one. It makes it so that you haven't revealed that you're under attack, and as you receive this, you know that this is information that you need to trust. And so if I go back to these challenges, timeliness, it's now timely because it's actually part of the incident response process, not something you've done afterwards. The second, operationalizing it. Once you get it, run a play on it. Have something as part of the security runbook when you receive that shared threat intelligence from your circle of trust. This is going to be some of the most important work that you do because it's from somebody you trust and you know it's timely. The third, ranking sources. This is probably going to be the highest one you trust because this is, you know it's from somebody you know, and you know that it's something that's real. Duplicative info, you know this one's highest because it came from that trusted group. The problem of contributing, anonymous makes contribution way easier. And because you're going to this small group of people. Now you can extend this, I'm using a 3-person example for simplicity, but this could start to go into hundreds of different people as long as you've got somebody administering the anonymity of the whole thing. And then lastly, real or fake, you know it's real because you trust the sender because it's part of your circle of trust as opposed to just something that might be coming from a random information sharing community. And so I'm going to walk through 2 use cases here on using shared threat intel to be able to proactively stop an attack. So the first scenario here is around some new indicator of compromise threat intel information was just posted from one of your trusted sources. So what you can do here from an automation perspective is once that information comes in, use automation to grab the information from that post and automatically go and search your SIEM, search other places where you've got security data to understand, do you have any instantiation of that information inside of your network? And so, these IOCs are probably going to be many of the things we see all the time: IP addresses, file hashes, and URLs. So, automatically search that data lake or a SIEM to understand if you've got that there. And if not, you can log it and then determine are there any changes you need to make to your protection technologies to make sure that you're going to be able to block this type of information in the future. But if you do find information from that shared threat intel inside of your organization, you can create and prioritize this work. You can assign it to an analyst, and you can go ahead and run, again, inside your security runbook, run the play of what happens when you've gotten new threat intel information from a trusted source. The outcome here is you've actually turned the threat intel model upside down. We typically use threat intel to do research when we're working on a security incident. But the outcome here is we've actually used threat intelligence that's shared from that trusted source into our organization to then proactively stop a particular problem before we actually see it inside of our network. So this is really taking the threat intel sharing area and making it so that you're actually using that to solve problems as opposed to using it when you're researching a problem that already exists. All right, last use case here. Using shared intel and this shared intel to prioritize vulnerability patching. So it kind of goes back full circle, kind of where we started with some of the vulnerability work. And another thing you can share in threat intel is information about, in this example, an exploit in the wild. We now know that there is a vulnerability out there and there's an active exploit being run against it. And so if you're able to share that information up into that platform, when you receive that information, you can then use an exploit if there's a vulnerability where there's an actual exploit in the wild that's being run and you have that vulnerability inside of your network, this may become sort of the highest priority work that your team's going to do. When you start looking at ransomware attacks, there's like 6 or 7 vulnerabilities that almost 90% of them use. If you patch those 6 or 7, you're going to be able to have way less ransomware attacks to go deal with and way less holes to go plug. But here you can use the exploit information in the wild to then prioritize, first find the systems that have that particular vulnerability, and then prioritize patching these systems regardless of the CVSS score. Because there's an exploit in the wild that's out there. A lot of exploits now are being written to the middle, like those CVSS 5s, because they know organizations are taking a long time to get those things patched, if ever. But you can use automation and orchestration to then trigger patching and to rescan that whole workflow we showed you a little while ago to manage the vulnerability patching process. And so the outcome here is you've actually proactively, through threat intel sharing, have proactively removed a vulnerability that has a very high likelihood of being used in an attack that you would not have known about, at least not yet, unless you were part of this circle of trust to be able to get information from your 2 friends or whatever those other companies may end up being that participate in that circle. So the last part here is one of the biggest reasons why both automation and threat intel sharing are really important is because all of us are having a very difficult time hiring talent. We hear horror stories of you hire a junior analyst, it takes them 6 months to get up to speed, they're productive for 6 months, and they move on to the next company as an experienced security analyst for almost double their salary. We've got to find ways to make their work more valuable. And if you're spending your time actually solving security problems versus cutting and pasting and doing research to go solve those problems, a security analyst is going to be a heck of a lot happier. But the other thing you can do is you're using shared threat intelligence. Your team of 5, all of a sudden, you've got a bigger team out there now because you've got the people that in my 3-person example you used to work with, they're actually working for you now And you're, of course, helping them too. But this actually fills in the gaps of all the people that we're unable to hire. This is a really important aspect and reasons why threat intel sharing is so important. All right, last slide here. Some things I hope you're going to take away from this is the first is after you go back and you get home, one of the things you should look at next week is your current vulnerability response process. This is probably the easiest place to get started with automation and orchestration because you've got a single scanner, you can or maybe two, and you can work with some of the different IT sources to figure out how you could potentially work on marrying the data between IT and vulnerability scans together. But just even assessing that process and understanding it as in a current state is a great thing to look at when you get back. The next area is then look for processes and places within that process where you can layer in automation. The front parts I showed you a little bit earlier are probably the best places to do it, correlating data and then prioritizing work for patching teams. And at the same time, you can start to do the exercise they suggest for next week, which is looking at your current security incident response process and start to document some of that. Many of us may have security runbooks that are documented digitally. Some may have it on paper. Many times it's tribal knowledge, and it may be sitting inside the heads of a few very senior people. Getting that information documented, a few different use cases documented is key to getting started. And then, a little bit later this year is start to look for use cases to create processes for part of the incident response process. And I purposely wanted to show a phishing response use case because that is one that can have a very big impact on the security team in terms of their time because of the number of phishing attacks that all of us are definitely seeing. And then once you've got those basics set up, this is where you can start to look, are there other parties or other people you can go start to create these circles of trust so you can then start to look for the ability to do some sharing of threat intelligence information. But you've really got to I use the example of a baby going from crawling to running. You've really got to look at process, get some of those processes going end to end, and then layer threat intel sharing on top of it to have a chance of being really successful here. So with that, we left a few minutes for questions. The gentleman's got here a microphone, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
You gave the example of a use case 5, in which you said that you can automate vulnerability prioritization and vulnerability closure process using threat intel. And you gave the example of ransomware exploiting a particular vulnerability. So in that case, the system also need to be connected to my CMDB to know my assets. Otherwise, you will not be able to understand the applicability. For example, you may be having a vulnerability on MS SQL 2008, but if it is not in my environment, that threat intel is of no use to me. So,
correct, yeah, and that's where the idea is being connected to some sort of asset database that understands whether it's a configuration management database or something else. Of understanding and having that asset already discovered is definitely key for that, for sure.
Yeah. So second follow-up question is that we have a use case wherein the banking regulator wants banks to share the threat intel and then anonymously send this information to all the other member banks. So there it fits perfectly well. Does it also fits into the MSSP environment who wants to fuse threat intel from multiple sources, but on client's individual environment want to give this threat intel information?
Yeah, and really any sort of circle of trust can be set up, whether it's an MSSP. You can also have a lot of parent-child company relationships. That's one of the places where we've talked to a lot of organizations about that, where you may have a large company that owns several subsidiaries, and they want to share threat intelligence that way. But any one of those different scenarios can definitely work for organizations.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, I'll hang out up here if anybody has any questions they want to ask privately. I thank you very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.